Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is September 22nd, and I hope we're doing well. I want to remind everybody that Module 3 has now opened, right? So I hope everybody got the quiz taken by Sunday night for Module 2. If there were any problems with that or any glitches, by all means, get in touch with me, okay? Just let me know, and we'll see what we can do. But today we are starting this new module. I will also let you know in about 3 weeks, we will be having our midterm exam. Okay, we're going to finish Module 3, and then the exam will cover Modules 1, 2, and 3. So remember, much of what we need to know, I'm not going over in class. We haven't covered everything in the lectures. So by all means, study the notes. Okay, make sure that you study the notes very well, because the midterm exam will cover everything. Okay, are there any questions before we get started? Anything at all? Okay, today, I am starting a new topic, and we are going to begin discussing a major social movement known as the Enlightenment. And this is going to be a movement that in many ways has never really ended. We're still in some ways going through it as we speak. And the Enlightenment is going to change everything about how Western civilization operates politically, socially, you name it. Simply put, the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that applied the scientific revolution to human society. An intellectual movement that applied the scientific revolution to human society. So what do I really mean by that? Well, there is a key word that helps us understand the Enlightenment, and that word is reason. That word is reason. Smart people, educated people, literate people had begun to look at the scientific revolution and the enormous potential that it promised, and decided that perhaps we could apply the very same principles to how we choose to live and also make tremendous progress. Why not apply the scientific revolution to all aspects of human life? And they came to conclude that if we use reason, if we use logic, which is another word for this, to examine our laws, our politics, our cultural values, all of the different institutions that we have lived under for generations, maybe we can fix problems. A key influencer on the Enlightenment, although he was not an Enlightenment thinker as much as he was a scientist, but a key influencer is Isaac Newton. And we talked about Newton before. Y'all remember that, right? Newton was able to demonstrate in a grand way that the universe is really just one big machine, that the earth and the stars and the heavens and science itself really just demonstrates that it's just one big machine in motion. And if we make this machine as efficient as possible, humanity will work better. And by the time Newton died, he was enormously popular, he was enormously respected. And so people are going to take that idea and just move it forward. Enlightenment thinkers were known as philosophers. Enlightenment thinkers were known as philosophers, social intellectuals. Philosophers could be economists, they could be journalists, they could be professors and teachers, they could be all types of individuals who, again, looked at human society and decided that reason and logic were a far better way to govern ourselves than, say, tradition or other means like that. Now, perhaps a good way to understand what we're talking about is to look at a few of these guys. We can't look at all of them, of course, but we can look at a few. And one early philosopher that gives us a good understanding of what the Enlightenment really means is this fella here, John Locke. Locke was English. Locke was English. And we don't need to get into his background, but we just need to know that he was raised in a literate family. He was, middle class. He was well educated. And Locke is really the father of sociology. Locke is really the father of sociology. And like a lot of these philosophers, he studied everything, but he is best known for this. And Locke became particularly interested in human development on an emotional level. What is the process by which we go from being infants and children into adulthood? You see, at this time, and this may seem pretty far out there, but guys like John Locke have had an influence since then. Children were largely treated the same way adults were treated. The minute you are old enough to walk, we're going to put you in the fields to get working. Children were often dressed like children, like adults. Children were often held to very close to the same expectations and standards as adults. Even in the criminal justice system, we often see children being punished for crimes, very much the same way adults would have been punished, so on and so forth. We just don't really see there being much of a difference in the way children are treated and the expectations put on them and those of adults. And Locke started to look at this, and he came to conclude that this is not actually healthy, that the mind of a child is very different than the mind of an adult. And the way in which we treat people, and the way in which we interact with them, and the way in which we hold them accountable needs to factor in their age and the fact that they are still developing. As we all know, children often behave in ways that we would never permit an adult to behave. And adults that quote unquote act like children are not thought very highly of, right? And that's because we understand children are not mature the way adults are. So we give them a pass. Locke's big work would be known as Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Now understand, he wrote another one on government, which we're going to look at. But in this work, he is going to assert that humans are born with what he would call a blank slate, an empty mind. We know nothing. The newborn infant is without any knowledge. And it is that child's environment that shapes that child's worldview and personality. You become who you are because of the environment that you were raised in. And that you becoming an educated person isn't just academic. You become educated by the interactions with your family and the interactions with your community and the experiences that you have. And that educates you as well. So you're born knowing nothing, and you are taught to become the person you become. Now, what this means, of course, is, number one, children need to be treated differently than adults. Childhood should be treated as a learning experience. All aspects of your childhood in one way or another need to be geared toward teaching you lessons that you will apply into adulthood. And of course, we can see that influence today, right? When we see parents that aren't being good parents, we think to ourselves, oh, those kids are going to turn out terrible, right? Those parents aren't doing their job. And then when we see good parents who are nurturing children and teaching them good values and behaviors and things like that, we're like, oh, well, they're doing a good job. Y'all get where I'm coming from, of course. Well, Locke says that's what we should do. Locke, of course, argues that what this means is there really is no difference between the nobility and the wealthy and the peasants and the poor. These people become that way because of how they were raised. If you take a newborn child of a noble family and a newborn child of a poor peasant family, and you switch them at birth, the poor peasant kid is going to grow up as a noble. The noble will grow up as a peasant. It is your environment that teaches you who you are. With this in mind, of course, we can create a much, much better society by simply making a priority out of raising children properly, right? If we put real emphasis on treating children as future adults who should be nurtured into a healthy way of thinking, we will create a much better society. We will create a much better society. Now, let me ask you this. Was he right? Well, he was right on some of this. Nobody would dispute that we should raise children properly and teach them good values and things like that. But here's what I'm wondering. Was he right about the idea of children being born with a blank slate, a blank mind, and you become who you are by your environment? Was he right about that? No. Maybe not, right? Because certainly we can all, we all know people that were raised in wonderful homes and had a great environment and turned out terrible, right? They certainly weren't taught that. Obviously, there had to be something inherent because they were given everything good, but yet they still turned out bad. And vice versa. There's plenty of examples that people that were raised in very negative environments that turned out to be terrific people, right? So yes, he's right to an extent. We do shape people's minds growing up. There's an enormous advantage in being raised properly, but at the same time, that's not a guarantee, is it? It's kind of a mix of both. What is the argument that they talk about when it comes to psychology classes and sociology classes on this subject? It's nature versus nurture, right? Are you born with a blank slate and turned into who you become, or is your personality something inherent that's not going to change? And of course, that debate is still raging today, isn't it? That is still raging today. Who in here would say, really, for the most part, we're shaped by our environment, that most people are pretty much identical at birth? And who in here would agree with Locke on that? Who in here says, no, this is inherent? Your personality is what it is. Most hands up on this one. I don't think anyone raised their hand on the other one. And what's interesting is whenever I talk about this with different classes, it goes back and forth. I have a lot of classes that will disagree with y'all. So it's an interesting debate to have, isn't it? But what matters, even if we never really come to a clear answer on this, what matters is that we're having the conversation, isn't it? What matters is that we're saying we need to raise our children and move our young people in society in a positive direction, and our role as adults is extremely important. Anyone in here think children ought to basically be treated like adults even at a young age? Sure about that? How about this? A recent study came out, and this was about, a year or two ago, and it examines adults that had become successful versus adults that hadn't. And they found that there is one underlying theme that seems to always exist in adults that turned out to do well in life. And that was their parents held them to very high standards, and they had very real expectations put on them at a young age with very real consequences. In other words, children that are pushed into adulthood by their parents, probably an age a little bit younger than they should, actually end up being far more likely to benefit, right? What is, I hate to use this term, and this is a modern term that's kind of showing up, and Locke would be discussing this. Locke is not saying we shouldn't be tough on kids and have expectations. Locke is saying we have to shape them, right? Education is not necessarily something that people enjoy having or being forced to grow up. There's a new term that started popping up, and it's called failure to launch. What is failure to launch? It is a real concern among sociologists, and it's young adults who don't seem to want to move into adulthood, right? And y'all know who we're talking about, right? Because y'all have seen these. And they graduate high school and they come from families that care about them, but they get into their 20s and they never really seem to become the real adults, right? They're still living at home. They refuse to, you get where I'm coming from, right? And a lot of people think that perhaps part of that is the result of them not being pushed when they're kids. Maybe a little bit more push into adulthood would be good for children. Y'all get where I'm coming from, right? Now, again, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but it's an interesting conversation to have, isn't it? Nature versus nurture. How do we raise children into adulthood? Social science. Locke is going to argue on a political level that government gets its power from the people. Government gets its power from the people. And that if a government is not performing its job adequately. If a government is not serving the people and acting in the people's best interest, then the people have the right to peacefully change it. If you have a bad government, you can go in and change the government, provided you do so peacefully. And this opens the door to conversations about things like democracy, representative government, etc. And on that note, let's move to another philosophe, a fellow by the name of Montesquieu. A fellow by the name of Montesquieu. Charles Louis Montesquieu. Now I'll ask you, with that name and that look, where's he from? He's French, absolutely. John Locke was English, Montesquieu was French. Montesquieu is the father of political science. He is deeply interested in how government works and where the power in government really lies and who really is in charge and who really should be in charge. And what he figures out is that not every government in Europe, and that's what he's studying, is the same, despite the fact that they may appear to be the same on the surface. And so he studies the different bureaucracies of the various countries. And he comes to conclude that there are, in fact, 3 different types of government. Now, I'm going to use different terms than him because we need to modernize the words. But there are absolute monarchies, which he would call tyrannical governments or dictatorships, but we'll just simply call it an absolute monarchy. And this is a monarchy where the king holds all of the power. He makes the law, he executes the law, he interprets the law. He's the king, Louis XIV. Now, y'all remember our conversation about him. The absolute boss without question. There are also constitutional monarchies. And these are where there is a king that executes the law, but a parliament, a legislature that creates the law. And of course, the example of this would be Britain, where there is a king that is the boss of the company, or the country in this case, but then the parliament gives the king the laws that he is supposed to govern by. And finally, there are republics. And these are states where if there is a monarch, he is more of a figurehead, and there is a parliament that more or less runs the country from beginning to end. And Montesquieu doesn't necessarily say that one of these is better than the other. What he says is it depends on really the size and diversity of the country. Big empires need to be absolute monarchies, according to Montesquieu. States like Russia and the Ottoman Empire need to have an absolute dictator on the throne, because without that, there would be chaos. These are very diverse countries. They're enormous in terms of their land mass. The only way to maintain law and order among such a big population is to have one man in charge that nobody can question. And it might not seem fair, but without it, we would see all forms of corruption, chaos, etc., etc. And so he argued that this was actually necessary in big, diverse states. Medium-sized states, he argued, should be constitutional monarchies. He thought the British government was the best example of how this worked. There is a king who is in charge and a parliament that gives the king the law that he is supposed to go by. And I think if I remember correctly in this class, I use this class as a simple example, right? I'm in charge of this class. I'm the boss, but I don't go by my own rules, do I? I am given a set of instructions from the college that I administer the class by. And the rules that I come up with myself are those that the college has told me I'm supposed to. But y'all get where I'm coming from, right? So Montesquieu would say that that would be a constitutional system. And in his mind, medium states do very well with this. It represents the voice of the people. The people can make the laws that they think work best for them. The king then executes the law. And in the event that we have somebody who isn't representing the people properly, they can be peacefully removed through the legal process. So constitutional monarchy, good for middle-sized states. Small states, city-states are very small countries, generally that are very homogeneous in culture. There isn't a lot of diversity in terms of who the people are. These are best as republics. States like the Netherlands or the small little German states that are really just big cities. He argued all they really need is a parliament, and it can govern things kind of like a city council, so to speak. And many of these, of course, will have a king or a duke or whoever that rules them, but these guys are figureheads. They don't have any real power, and they don't need it, according to Montesquieu. Just somebody who represents who the people are on a social level, but that's about it. Montesquieu decided, because we're using logic and reason to govern ourselves, that perhaps we should create a blueprint for a country. If somebody were to say, let's build a government, well, let's put together a blueprint and decide how it ought to be. And based on the constitutional model, he argued that a government ought to have three branches. There ought to be three components of a government. Number one, there should, of course, be the king, who executes the law. The second branch of government should, of course, be the parliament. And it, of course, makes the law. And then finally, number three, we should have the judicial branch, or the courts. And what is the role of the judicial branch? It is there to interpret the law. If there is any question as to what the law means, it is this third branch of government that will do that. Now, when we talk about the judicial branch and we talk about the courts, we're not talking about criminal courts. We're not talking about the courts that you would sue your neighbor in if he, ran over your fence. We're talking about legal issues that would involve what the law means. Now, what would I really mean by that? Why do we need a judicial branch to interpret the law? I mean, the law is right there. I can read it. You can read it. The king can read it. Well, the reality is, just because something is written down doesn't mean that there is one universal meaning to what it says. And part of developing the ability to think critically is embracing that one simple concept. You and I can read exactly the same piece of paper, and you can derive a different meaning of it than I can, but neither one of us are necessarily right or wrong. Let's give you an example of what we're talking about in a country that would need a judicial branch and why Montesquieu said this was such a critical part of the government. Let's say that we're England. Let's say that we're England. And because we're human and we're not perfect, we're going to go to war with somebody because they've made us mad and we got to go to war. Now, let's pick a country we need to go to war with. Who are we going to go to war with? They've been to war with all of them, so pick one. Well, the USA. That's right, fine. We're going to go to war with America, right? It's 1812, and we're going to go to war with America because those pesky Americans, we got to teach them a lesson. Let's invade New Orleans, right? Hope they don't have Andrew Jackson in charge. Okay, so Parliament says we're going to go to war with the Americans. Now, what happens when you go to war? Well, you got to raise an army, right? You have to raise a lot of money. You often have to raise taxes. A lot of people are going to get killed. It's going to be very unpleasant affair, but we all want to do it. So Parliament passes a law authorizing the king to go to war. The king raises an army. The king raises taxes. We go to war with the United States, and it turns out we only fight this war for a few years. We burn Washington, D.C., we try to take New Orleans, and we fail, and the war ends. But we don't necessarily sign a peace agreement. We just go back home, and the war's kind of over. Or maybe we sign a peace agreement, but the Americans don't ratify it, right? Or something like that. And a few years pass, and those pesky Americans are giving us trouble again, and so we decide we're going to go to war with them again. And so the king starts raising his army, and the king starts putting the money together, and Parliament says, hold on a minute. We didn't tell you you could go to war with the United States. And the king says, well, you most definitely did. I've got the law right here. You passed it several years ago, authorizing me to go to war with the USA. And Parliament says, no, no, no. No, we didn't. That law was for that time. But you see, that war is now over, so if you want to go to war with America again, you're going to have a new law. And this time around, we don't think it's worth it. We don't think we need to. And the king says, no, I don't think that you're right, Parliament. I've got a law right here. And I've got all your little signatures down here saying I'm authorized. And you see, I'm looking at this peace treaty that we signed, and it turns out they didn't ratify it, which means the peace treaty is invalid. We're still at war with the United States. I'm sending the army. And Parliament says, no, 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 no. That war is over. Y'all get where I'm coming from, right? Well, what that would then do is go to the court. And the court would say, yes, this is still an active conflict, or no, this conflict ended. You get where I'm coming from? Neither side is necessarily correct in a legal dispute. We've got to have a court to interpret that. There are a myriad of complicated legal issues that laws frequently do not address. And we need a court system that can sort that out. Now, it is critical then that the judicial branch be completely independent of the Parliament or the king. Because if the king can appoint judges anytime he wants, if the king can get rid of judges anytime he wants, if the king has free reign over the judicial system, the courts are always going to rule in favor of the king, aren't they? What's the point of having a judicial system if it can never go against what the king wants? And the same would be true with the Parliament. If the judicial system can never go against what the Parliament wants, then the judicial system is pointless, isn't it? Right? So Montesquieu said this judicial system has to be completely independent of the king, completely independent of the Parliament. Judges have to feel free to rule however they think is right without any fear of losing their job or anything like that. And so we have a three-branch system. Now, if this looks familiar, I hope it does. Why does it? Why are y'all looking at that and saying, hey, I think I recognize something there? This is ours. Yeah, this is our government, right? The American founding fathers who came along a little bit later had grown up studying men like John Locke and Montesquieu. They were philosophes themselves, George Washington and Ben Franklin and the like. And so when they came to create the U.S. Constitution, they decided, let's give Montesquieu a try. Let's see if Montesquieu's blueprint for a government will work. And so the U.S. Constitution is based on this book here, Spirit of Laws, written by Montesquieu. His work had just simply been written down. It had just been in a book. And so our founding fathers dusted it off and said, okay, let's see if it works. And so in a spiritual sense, Montesquieu is an American founding father. What's going on right now as we speak? That is a spirited discussion regarding this. Does anybody know? Yep, exactly. Yeah, we just had a Supreme Court justice die a couple of days ago. The United States federal court system is very much based on the idea of being independent of the president or the Congress. That's a key part of what Montesquieu says, and that's a key part of how our federal court system works. Federal judges, and you have to write this down, I'm just letting you know, federal judges are nominated by the president and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And so the president puts a name out there, I think you'd make a great federal judge, but then the Senate has to vote to approve them. Are y'all following me? That way both branches of government have had a role to play. But one of the laws is federal judges have a lifetime appointment. They are hired for life. Now, they can be impeached if they commit crimes, but generally speaking, and it's their job as long as they want that job. This includes the Supreme Court, plus the two other lower levels of courts that operate on a federal level. All different federal courthouses have a judge in them. We've got a federal courthouse over in Gulfport with a federal judge, and it's his appointment for life, and he was nominated by the president and approved by the Congress as well. Well, obviously, the Supreme Court's the big court, right? Now, how many justices sit on the U.S. Supreme Court? 9. 9 justices sit on the Supreme Court, and because it is a lifetime appointment, they have a tendency to grow rather old on the bench. Many times they retire, but frequently they just go into their golden years, which means that from time to time, one of them will die on the bench, which is what just happened with Justice Ginsburg. She was 87 years old. And so now that she has died, President Trump is authorized to nominate her replacement, and of course, the U.S. Senate is authorized to vote on her replacement and put somebody else on the bench. The reason why this is such a big fight is that just like every other, part of our government, there is politics involved, right? And Justice Ginsburg tended to have a judicial philosophy that sided with what the Democrats like. And so her death means that a Republican can replace her, and chances are the person that replaces her will not have the same judicial philosophy as her. And so it swings the philosophical nature of the court in a way that benefits the Republicans over the Democrats. And so the Democrats are, of course, not very happy about it, right? And I don't want to get into modern politics, but this same thing happened in 2016 when Trump was running for president, and the Republican-controlled Senate would not allow President Obama to replace a justice that died then. And the Republicans were saying, no, we've got to wait till after the election because that's only fair. But now that it's the Republicans that can benefit, they're not doing that. And so the Democrats are kind of angry about it. It's called politics, folks, right? It doesn't matter what side you believe. I can assure you politics get injected into everything. But this is a process that I hope that you'll watch, if only because I want you to learn how our federal court system works, right? And Supreme Court justices are part of that. Well, moving forward, let's talk about Voltaire. Let's talk about Voltaire. Now, that was not his name. That's just his nickname, what he liked to go by. He was also French, but to be honest with you, once he became an adult, he kind of lived everywhere. He would have considered himself European. Like Montesquieu and John Locke, he also came from the middle classes. He was well educated. Voltaire was particularly concerned with freedom of speech. He became troubled by the idea that ideas are no longer allowed to be, or never have been really, allowed to be expressed openly. In his mind, people should be able to speak whatever they're thinking. And there is no crime involved in having an opinion, no matter how unpleasant that opinion may appear to others. Actions, of course, can be evil, but at the end of the day, thoughts and speech can't. And so in his mind, freedom of speech really mattered. And he was very troubled by the fact that France was so censored. The king, of course, will punish anybody that speaks out in a way that the king doesn't like. And Voltaire thought that was wrong. He didn't like it. He was much more a fan of the British system, which wasn't 100% freedom of speech, but was certainly a lot more. You can criticize the king in Britain. You can speak out against the king if you don't like what he's doing, or you can speak out against the parliament. Those guys are a bunch of corrupt jerks, right? You can say that, and you don't have to worry about disappearing in the middle of the night. Now, Voltaire also was smart enough to realize that he can get his ideas out there through entertainment. Just writing a boring paper like Montesquieu and John Locke means you're going to, your stuff's going to get put on a shelf somewhere and nobody's going to read it. And so what Voltaire did was he became a playwright. And plays are, needless to say, very popular back then. And so he would write plays where the characters would go through these various challenges that highlighted his ideas. And his most famous work is known as Candide. It was a very popular play. And in it, what he effectively argues is that freedom of speech is very positive. and that you don't have to agree with what that other person is saying, but you do need to fight for their right to say it. I can be completely opposed to you, but I'm not going to stand in the way of your ability to express yourself. Because, of course, I don't want anyone to stand in the way of me expressing myself either, right? And the only way we come up with good ideas is if we get rid of the bad ones. Now, how do we figure out a bad idea? Well, we have to talk about it, don't we? We have to experiment with it. We have to try things to see what works and what doesn't. That's science, isn't it? Well, Voltaire says it's the same thing with society. So let's talk about the bad ideas. Let's have people express themselves that are wrong. Let's work through everything. Let's trust people to be able to understand the good from the bad. Now, Voltaire was himself somewhat of a celebrity. He became very popular throughout Europe. He lived at various, noble courts until he would, anger the wrong person and be run off. It was kind of a thing to get to have Voltaire stay at your court. Spent a lot of time in Germany, as I understand. He did not like absolutism. He believed, obviously, that parliamentary government was far better. He did not like entrenched power. He argued that the minute somebody comes into power, they will do everything possible to keep it, even if it means becoming corrupt and evil and bad. And so nobody in power should be without scrutiny. And nobody should hold power for too long. Nobody should hold power for too long. Again, we can see the influence of this in the United States. Again, Voltaire was read by everybody. One of the most important moves in the early American Republic that tends to be overlooked, but it was critical and it was a big deal at the time, was when George Washington stepped down after 2 terms. George Washington served 2 terms as president, and then he decided, I'm stepping down. I'm not running for a 3rd term. He could have easily been elected for a 3rd term. As a matter of fact, there was a time when he probably could have been made king. There were even members of the Constitutional Convention that wanted to turn the United States into a monarchy and make George Washington the first king. But George Washington said, no, we do not want somebody who never loses power. We do not want somebody who is unelected to have any authority. And after he stepped down after 2 terms, he said, this is important. This needs to be a precedent. Nobody needs to serve president for too long. At some point, you have to give that title to somebody else. And Voltaire was very much behind that idea. And so we can see these ideas start to gain traction. We're going to talk about somebody a little bit more challenging now. We're going to talk about Diderot. Like these other philosophers, Diderot studied pretty much everything. He was a jack of all trades academically. Diderot published the first real encyclopedia, a 28-volume mega work that touches on the entire breadth of human knowledge. Again, an encyclopedia. We all know what an encyclopedia is. They're not really so much of a thing anymore because we don't use paper encyclopedias. What's the modern version of the encyclopedia? Yeah, Google, Wikipedia, right? The internet, right? We've got, you want to study the breadth of human knowledge, all you got to do is, open up your smartphone and it's there, right? Now, the encyclopedia that Diderot came up with was not intended to make you an expert on any of this. It was just intended to have short pieces of information to give you an opening to learn more. I'm gonna allow you to read it and you can kind of see what you're interested in, and then you can go out and study it more later on. But the idea behind the encyclopedia is that it would cover everything. Now, the minute he publishes it, of course, it's going to be heavily censored because there's going to be topics in the encyclopedia that people like King Louis in France don't like people reading about, right? And so when you say we're going to study everything, we're going to put the good, the bad, and the ugly all in there at once. And so the encyclopedia was, oddly enough, quite controversial. And different versions of it ended up getting published in different places because of it. But you get the idea. Diderot was a firm believer in freedom of speech. In his mind, he took it even further than Voltaire had. We should be able to talk about anything. And if you are really going to consider yourself an enlightened adult, you should allow yourself to listen to anything without getting angry. No matter how troubling those words may be, a real adult sits down and listens, right? You always know you've got the winning argument when the other person just tries to shut you up before you say anything, right? You know, I think that politician is saying, shut up, don't talk, right? Well, obviously they don't want you to talk because you're going to say something that might be right. You see what I'm saying? A great way for me to never be wrong is for nobody to ever get to explain why I'm wrong. So what you have to do is never try to shut someone else up and never tolerate somebody who tries to shut you up. That's what Diderot would say, right? You always know you've got the winning argument. Well, not always, but you get the idea. It's called heckler's veto, right? I'm not going to let you say anything. I'm just going to scream you down or shut you up or whatever. And Diderot would say, that's not good. Diderot became particularly well known, and again, he is a controversial figure, for his criticism of religion. His criticism of religion. He believed you can worship any way you want, of course. Feel free to be a Christian or not be a Christian or pick a flavor of Christianity. Diderot, obviously you can have your own opinion on that. But he was critical of the political nature of religion. And he was heavily critical of the Roman Catholic Church, which he argued was not really about saving souls and spreading the word of Christ. The Roman Catholic Church, in his mind, was about money and power. You know, its primary motivation was that. He argued the church is far more interested in getting as much money out of people than it is anything else. You know, he, of course, pointed out the fact that these bishops and cardinals live in palaces, right? They're the wealthiest men in Europe, despite the fact that clergy are supposed to be poor. You'd never see it with them. All kinds of behavior that he sees church leaders engaging in are the very antithesis of what they are preaching. These are incredibly sinful people who seem to be preaching everybody else needing to follow the word of God. And what he points out is that the church has had a very close alliance with the king. Pick a country, of course. But wherever you find the Catholic Church in power, the king and the church are allies. And France would probably be the best example. Again, he's the one who figures this out, makes this argument. The king uses his enormous military and political power to force everybody to be members of the church, and the church turns around and uses its enormous spiritual power to preach loyalty to the king. You know, look at Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII, right? Louis XIII has the army, and everybody must go to church or you're a heretic and we're going to burn you at the stake. And then, of course, once you're in church, you are immediately taught that God chose that king and you cannot question him in any way, or else you are questioning God's will. And so really what's happening is it's just a cozy partnership between the church and the king, all designed to control the people, to suppress their freedom, to suppress their ability to live their own lives, and of course to take as much of their money as possible. Diderot would argue, now think about this, that the church really manipulates people into following. Here is a belief system, now I'm Diderot here, that has no logical premise. We have a book that was written thousands of years ago, well, in his case, 1,800 years ago-ish. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know what language it is. It talks about all kinds of events that scientifically cannot happen. A magic man who, was crucified and ascended into heaven for some strange reason that even the church can't really explain. We don't even know if that guy existed. And you are expected to obey this and follow this and believe in this without question from cradle to grave. And if you in any way say, I don't think that can happen, What's going to happen is, of course, God is going to smite you and you're going to go to hell and you're going to burn for all eternity with absolutely no relief from your eternal suffering, simply because you used your brain to question whether or not this is actually true. Oh, and by the way, God loves you. Diderot would say, come on, folks, think about this for a minute. One of the most important rules in life is don't be a chump, and it sounds to me like you're being a chump. If you want to believe this, go right ahead, but at least acknowledge that none of it really makes sense. And Diderot would take it one step further. He would say, what's really keeping people in line here? Why are people really going to church and buying into this stuff, even though there's no proof of any of it? Why are people really doing it? Well, he would say what's really happening is fear. That's what's really happening. People are going to church because they're scared. They're scared of what's going to happen to them if they don't go and they don't pay their tithe. The king's men are going to show up and you're going to disappear in the middle of the night. Or worse, we're going to burn you at the stake. Did you know that the church was burning people at the stake for the mere crime of reading the scripture? I'm not making that up. There were times not too far away from when Diderot lived, where if you were an ordinary person and you just had the audacity to read the Bible, you would be considered a heretic. The first man to translate the Bible into English was burned at the stake as a heretic for doing so. Now, why on earth would the church be so insecure that it would burn someone at the stake for merely interpreting the Bible into a language that the people could read? People might start thinking for themselves. That's exactly right. People might start reading that scripture in English, and the people in England might say, this sounds like nonsense to me. And we can't have that. The reason why you're going to church is because you're scared. That's it. You don't really believe this stuff. You're scared. That's Diderot talking. And, of course, you're scared of God. Maybe there really is this God up there that's going to send me to hell if I don't buy into it. So I'm going to play along to be on the safe side. Diderot would say, come on, quit your fear. Get rid of it. Don't be afraid anymore. Believe what you want to believe, but if fear is the motivator, quit it. Use your own brain. That very same God gave you the ability to think for yourself. And you will be a far healthier person, and we will have a far better society if people think for themselves. And where should the bad ideas go? Away. Even if those bad ideas are scary, right? Even if those bad ideas are troubling, we've already covered that. We are a better society by getting rid of bad ideas and replacing them with good ideas and using logic and reason, I erased it on the board, to govern ourselves. I don't need to tell you that Diderot was disliked by people in Europe, do I? He was heavily censored. They hated him in France. They hated him in places like Spain and Italy. Of course, the Dutch printed his books left and right because the Dutch don't care. They just want to make money. And so in the Netherlands, of course, it was printed everywhere. When you censor a book, it's great for its sales, right? The minute you ban a book, everybody wants to read it. And so Diderot became extremely well read. Let's move on to Adam Smith. Let's move on to Adam Smith. Now, with a name like Adam Smith, what is he? Yeah, he's English. He's English. Adam Smith is the father of economics. Adam Smith is the father of economics. And his best known work is known as The Wealth of Nations. And it is in this book, and again, scary, he takes on mercantilism, the very foundation of Europe's economic system. Adam Smith challenges. And he comes to conclude that mercantilism is all wrong. Mercantilism is not a good way to govern an economy. Now let's walk through mercantilism real quick again so you can see where I'm coming from. Mercantilism is a system that emphasizes gold. Wealth comes from having lots of gold, and the nations with the most gold are going to be the wealthiest and most powerful. The nations that have the least gold are going to be the poorest. And under a mercantile economy, what happens is you try to bring as much gold in and orchestrate trade barriers and trade agreements that enable you to sell your stuff to other countries, but don't let them sell their stuff in yours. Because if I sell my stuff in their country, I get their gold, don't I? And if they don't sell their stuff in mine, they don't get my gold. And so a country like England will try to sell as much of its tobacco in continental Europe that it's growing in the Virginia colonies, because that tobacco brings in gold. But then when the French try to sell their furs in England, we don't want that. Because if we buy French furs, our gold goes to them. You get where I'm coming from? So let's set up silos where you can be England and you can be France and you can be Spain and you can be the Italian states, and we're all going to try to manipulate each other. And gold, gold, gold is the key. And the more gold I bring in, the better off I am as a country. And Adam Smith looked at this and he said, nope, that's not the way it works. This is a tough one for people to wrap their heads around, because I don't know about you, but gold is pretty nice to have, isn't it? The more gold you give me, the happier I'm going to be. Anybody in here have a problem with getting gold, right? Makes a lot of sense that the more gold we can get in our country, the better off we're going to be. So there's a tough sell that Adam Smith says you don't understand. This is not what's really going on. You see, Spain had all the gold it could possibly want and ended up poor. The Netherlands are a cold, barren swamp with no gold at all, but the Dutch are among the wealthiest people in the world. So something's not right here if gold is what matters. There's something else happening. And he finally concludes that gold is merely a representation of labor. That gold itself is nothing more than a metal. It doesn't mean anything. It's just an element in the earth that we mine out of it. It's what gold represents that actually gives it its value. You see, we could get rid of gold as currency and pick up some other precious metal, right? Instead of it being gold, now we're all going to try to get platinum. Instead of it being platinum, we're all going to try to get, wampum beads, you name it. Gold is nothing more than a representation of the work that went into getting it. It's a medium of exchange. It is a medium of exchange. What really makes a nation wealthy is the labor of its people. That's what makes a nation wealthy. Hardworking people are going to get a lot of gold, aren't they? Lazy, incompetent people are not going to get a lot of gold. So let's not worry about how much gold we have. Let's focus on how hard our people work. You see, Spain became a poor nation because it did not invest in its population. The Spanish king did not educate his people. He didn't try to build a middle class that created goods and sold them. Britain and the Netherlands did. Queen Elizabeth pushed the growth of a middle class. Queen Elizabeth pushed literacy. She pushed entrepreneurship. She encouraged the ordinary people in England to go out and make something of themselves. So if you are a nation of hardworking, industrious, educated people, you will be a wealthy nation. And if you are a nation of poor, illiterate peasants, you're going to be a poor nation. And it don't matter how much gold is out there or what you happen to use as the money. Smith argued that trade barriers that try to play games with what I sell you and what you sell me actually are bad for everyone. He said we should have free trade. We should have open trade. Every country should trade with every other country without any restrictions at all. The French should be able to buy as much English tobacco as they want. The English should be able to buy as many French furs as they want. Open the door to trade completely. And you say to yourself, well, that's great, but if I'm France and we can just import all the English tobacco we want, all of our gold will go to England. We'll buy up all that tobacco because for some strange reason, once people start smoking it, they can't quit. And French furs, hey, they fall out of fashion. Those English don't want any of our French furs. What would Adam Smith tell the French? How about you find something else? How about you work harder? How about you invent a new industry that will make a demand happen? Rather than try to manipulate your way into wealth, how about you innovate your way into wealth? If you don't have anybody that can produce anything anyone wants to buy, go out and educate people, right? That's how you become wealthy. That's how you become secure. The problem with Spain is that Spain didn't produce anything anybody wanted to buy. That's the problem. So if Spain doesn't want to be a third-rate power anymore, that's what it needs to do. Educate its middle class, build it, build academies, put money into infrastructure. But of course, if you build a middle class in Spain, the peasants suddenly want a parliament and power and authority from the king, don't they? And so dictators don't like that. Dictators don't like that. Here's a quick little personal example that we have to think about. Let's take two people, two young people. And one of them is raised in a very indulging family with parents that are rather wealthy, and they give this kid everything he wants. He never has to work for anything. He never has to go out and get a job. He never has to do chores. We talked earlier with Adam Smith and, failure to launch, right? And he gets 18, 19, 20, and he doesn't bother doing well in college. Maybe he doesn't go, whatever, and it doesn't matter. Mom and dad keep helping him out, right? He gets a check every month and whatever. He moves into his 20s and 30s, and he never bothers picking up decent jobs or doing anything productive with his life. And then all of a sudden, mom and dad die, and there's no more money. Well, he's in trouble, isn't he? And he's in trouble because he never invested in himself. Right? He never did something that will enable him to be on his own. Now let's take another kid who doesn't have that advantage, and he maybe grows up in a family that is challenged and he isn't given much, and he works hard and he makes good grades because he knows, man, I've got to do this myself. If I want to go to college, I'm going to have to get a scholarship, so I'd better do well. And when he gets in college, he's paying his own tuition or he's paying his own bills, and so he isn't going to make B's and C's. He's going to make A's, right? When you're at a stoplight, and the guy next to you peels out and smokes his tires and takes off, there's one thing that you know right away, and that's he didn't pay for those tires, right? Because when you pay for your own tires, you don't peel out at the lights. So this kid invests in himself. He gets jobs, different jobs to help pay his bills and different jobs to help get by. And he gets into his 20s and he gets a job and he's taking care of himself. And then, he gets that same age and all of a sudden he loses his job. Coronavirus comes along or something and he suddenly finds himself out of work. And now you have two people who are in basically exactly the same situation. There's no more money coming in when before they had money coming in. The first guy, he's in real trouble, isn't he? But the second guy, not so much, right? The second guy has hit a speed bump, but he's going to be fine, isn't he? Because he's got a good education and he's got a good resume and he has all these other people that he worked for that he can call on. He's got references. He's got job experience. He'll be fine. He'll find something else. Because he invested in himself. You see where I'm coming from? And so Adam Smith would say countries have to be the same way. We have to invest in our country. We have to invest in the next generation. We have to invest in infrastructure. We have to invest in college education. We have to push to build a middle class. Because that way, we will continue to be a nation that is wealthy. That is how nations build wealth. Nations like Britain and the Netherlands were that way. Nations like Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy weren't. And so you see the difference, right? Mercantilism, trade barriers, let's get as much gold as possible through any hook or crook we can come up with, bad idea. Let's open up our borders. Let's trade as much as possible. And if our country is not up to speed, we need to invest in our country and get it up to speed. And here's the best part that Adam Smith would say, a rising tide obviously lifts all boats, doesn't it? Hard work is good for everybody. When we invest in our economy, everybody does better. The United States is actually a pretty good example of that. Do we have poor people and dispossessed people in the United States? Are they vastly better off than the poor and dispossessed people in lesser developed countries? Yes, they are. Because certainly we all don't like poverty, and certainly we want to get as much help to as many people as possible. But if I'm going to be poor, I'd much rather be poor here than be poor in other parts of the world. You see where I'm coming from? What does the United States give poor people? Not perfectly, of course. That lesser developed countries don't. Gives them opportunity, right? There is no other nation in the world where if you are born down here, you have the opportunity to move up. Far from perfect. But you understand why Adam Smith would say that's so critical, right? Adam Smith would say creating that opportunity and investing in the population is what really makes a nation wealthy. And you know what? One day is going to come along and he would say, we don't use gold as money anymore. We're not all walking around with gold coins in our pockets. We're going to use something else as the money, and it ain't going to matter, is it? It will not matter, because whatever it is we're using to buy stuff with, the nations that do it right will end up being successful, wealthy nations. Now, Wealth of Nations is not a book that is 100% perfect. There's plenty of criticism of this. Adam Smith is going to argue, and this is where some things get a little bit more controversial. In a policy he calls laissez-faire, which is just French for hands off. He argues that the government should have a hands-off approach when it comes to the economy. The government should have very little to do with economic policy. Let people do whatever they want to do, make money however they make it, very little trade barriers. And the more freedom people have to go out and be themselves in this regard, the more prosperous a nation will be. And like I said, there are different versions of this, and there are those that argue that some elements of laissez-faire are not good. From the philosophes, we get social science, as I mentioned earlier. The science of man. We will get the professional fields of history, political science, economics, sociology, philosophy. You get the idea. Now, who is challenged by the Enlightenment? Who might not like the Enlightenment so much? Who might look at the Enlightenment and say, I'm not so sure that I like what's going on here? People in power. Yeah, a lot of people in power. Yeah, that's exactly right. The old King Louis, he's not a big fan of the Enlightenment, is he? Right? A lot of high-ranking church leaders are looking at this and saying, no, this isn't good. You know, as these philosophers point out, once people get into power, they will do whatever they can to not give it up. So the church, the monarchy, traditional institutions, people who have already become established and life is doing well for them, they don't want to see a lot of changes, and they're threatened by this. And this is highly controversial. I don't want you to think that every philosopher was very open-minded and wanted to see all of these changes. Many of them were what we would call conservative. Montesquieu, for example, was far more interested in kings having power and what we would say conservative government than people give him credit for. There is going to be, within the Enlightenment, a philosopher by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft. And I don't need to tell you what makes Mary Wollstonecraft stand out among the philosophers. And as one of the few female members of that club, she, of course, is going to be the first what we would call feminist or women's rights advocate. And she openly calls for women to become just as well educated as men, and for women to hold positions of power just like men do. And in her mind, there is no logical reason, if we apply reason to this, why a woman should not be equal to a man in any field that you point out. Why should a king always be a man? Why can't we have queens too? Why should parliaments be full of nothing but men? Why shouldn't women sit in parliament? Why shouldn't women be judges? The late Ginsburg would certainly agree, right? And of course, this challenges an awful lot of social norms that are going to make people uncomfortable. But again, it's a conversation that needs to be had because she's making a lot of sense, isn't she? Why shouldn't women play the same roles in terms of power structure that men do as well? The philosophers would often meet in what we would call salons. This is an intellectual movement. And oddly enough, Paris was the ground zero of the Enlightenment. And the salons in Paris were sort of like social clubs. There were many different versions of them. Some were very elite and were very expensive to be a part of. Others were sort of much more lowbrow. Many salons were nothing more than brothels. But the idea is a salon is a place where you can go and discuss these ideas and debate these ideas and figure out what seems to work and what doesn't. And that's where an awful lot of this gets spread. That's where an awful lot of this gets spread. And why would I say that Paris is sort of ironically the center of the Enlightenment? Why is that kind of interesting? Why not London or some other place like that? You know, the Amsterdam. Why is it Paris? Why would that not be where you would expect? I'm sorry? Yeah, Paris is a place where the Enlightenment is needed the most. You know, the absolute monarchy in Paris does not like the Enlightenment, or at Versailles. This is not where these ideas are embraced by the leadership. But nonetheless, Paris is really Europe's premier city at this time. Paris is the jewel of Europe in many ways. The Parisians consider it. All roads kind of lead to Paris on an intellectual level at this time. So Paris is where this pops up. And there's a lot of debate over, the extent to which the King of France was comfortable with these, because, they're arguing things that he himself would not agree with. But there you go. Now, on that note, it looks like we're almost out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and end early so I can get this uploaded, okay? Y'all have a great day, and I will see everybody on Thursday.